Okay, I think this is where we left off. Antioxidants. So, a lot of metabolic processes, well, they involve ions. In other words, an ion is an element that has either gained or donated an electron. So it's either plus or minus. And a lot of these are free radicals, so they're destructive because they interact with a lot of other cell chemistry. So some antioxidants are rich in, vitamins are rich in antioxidants, which kind of neutralize the free radicals. Beta-carotene, vitamin C, a number of things like that. Okay, fats. So there's still a big debate. At one point in an American nutritional history, fats were considered bad. You know, what are fats used for? Lipids, anybody remember? One of the main things that we use them for. Remember the cell wall and the phospholipid bilayer? So fats, we use fats for all sorts of stuff besides storing energy. Then it was like unsaturated fats are better than saturated fats. And the difference there is that saturated fats are solid at room temperature and unsaturated are liquid at room temperature. Recently, it was found that dietary fat really does not affect blood cholesterol levels. Cholesterol is a molecule that is a protein and a fat. And cholesterol is actually made in the liver. So it doesn't mean that fats are good. They're just maybe not as bad as people thought. So, you know, you shouldn't go out there and start, you know, eating a bunch of, just a big chunk of fat. Not a good idea. But unfortunately, see, nutrition science is not really a science. They have all these guidelines, many of which have never been tested properly in a scientific study. That's why they keep changing. There used to be a food pyramid, all that. I think if you eat food that is, you know, vegetables and some meat and all that kind of stuff, you're fine. You just don't want to start pounding down processed foods, which are the kinds of things that are generally high calorie. They put lots of sugar in a lot of those foods, among other things. Now, myself, I always cook with butter. If I'm going to need butter or margarine, I always use butter. It's not worth it. Margarine is foolishness. Okay. So, fatty acids, they're a great source of energy, and our body stores lots of energy in fat. At the same time, turns out everybody used to think that fat or fat cells were basically that's all they did. Well, turns out fat cells actually interact with hormones to signal other things to the brain about appetite, all sorts of different things. Now, of course, we also use fatty acids, like I just said, for cell membranes, for steroidal hormones like cholesterol, a lot of different reasons than just storing actually fat. Or okay. Okay, so we can synthesize most fatty acids from scratch. Those that we cannot are called what? So remember we talked about amino acids? There were, what kind of different amino acids were there? Huh? Speak up, I'm deaf. Yes, exactly. Good. Same thing with fatty acids. Okay. So, in other words, there are some fatty acids that we actually get only from our diet. Oh. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, some fatty acids are saturated or unsaturated. These are actually fatty acids. These are polymers, like we talked about with amino acids, long strings of fatty acids that they generally have a carbon backbone with hydrogens attached, and then on one side carbon and oxygens. Okay? Now, saturated fats are straight chain, like this, up here. Okay. And they are, because there's no kinks in them, they are solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats like vegetable oils, olive oil, all that kind of stuff, those are unsaturated, and it's because they have extra things added like a kink here. And so they remain room temperature. At room temperature, they remain liquid. However, you can actually turn an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat. Saturated fats, the fatty acid carbons, are bound to as much hydrogen as possible. The unsaturated most plant fats are unsaturated. Now we can actually turn, like I said, an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat, like turning a vegetable oil into margarine, by a process called hydrogenation, where we add hydrogens to the chains and we basically get rid of these carbon bonds right here. Partially hydrogenated fats are sometimes called trans fats. Okay. Apparently, unsaturated fats are healthier than saturated fats. But I will say, one of the reasons a ribeye is so tasty is because of the saturated fat that it has. That adds a lot of flavor And that's why if you, let's say, eat a lean sirloin steak, it's not nearly as flavorful as a ribeye. Now, in terms of cardiovascular disease, it's thought that unsaturated fats have health benefits. You've probably heard of the Mediterranean diet, things like that. Whereas saturated fats like cheese and salami and hot dogs and all that kind of stuff will start making your arteries snap shut, like castanets. You know, you can actually hear it. You know, your arteries start like a big fatty breakfast with eggs and bacon and ham and sausage, all that kind of stuff. You know, and then you pour gravy over it. Oh, it's so good. But afterwards, you know, your arteries are probably going to clog up at a certain point. Even though they're not going to exactly clog up with cholesterol from that fatty food, it's going to be processed in the liver and then turned into a fat, into cholesterol. Now, we use cholesterol. Is needed to build cell membranes and also a whole bunch of steroid hormones. So you can see basic cholesterol over here, and then you can start adding things to it. So here's a testosterone. Estrogen is another one. They add a hydroxyl group. Let's see, what else is, a lot of those androgen steroid hormones for bodybuilding and all that kind of stuff. Now, these things are naturally occurring. Cholesterol, because it's a fat, it's not water soluble. Okay, that's why it's so good in cell membranes. And cholesterol is a hormone, it's a protein, but it has to be carried by lipid-based particles, in other words, fatty particles. Okay, so in terms of cholesterol, there's what's considered good, better cholesterol and worse cholesterol. HDL and LDL. HDL is high-density lipoproteins. LDL is low-density lipoproteins. These are created in the liver, and they can then be recycled. Okay, so they're used for all sorts of different things. Now, it turns out LDL is the bad sort of cholesterol, and I'm sure no one in here is actually taking steroids. Taking statins at this point. You've probably heard of statins like Lipitor, things like that. But people who have high cholesterol, what they're trying to do is they're trying to lower the concentration of LDL. Now, there are also triglycerides that leads to arteriosclerosis and blockages and things like that. So that's why people are taking statins. They've been a huge benefit, and they've really cut down the incidence and mortality from heart attacks and strokes and things like that. Okay. Now, sugar and carbohydrates. The simplest sugar is glucose. In fact, that's what our body generally breaks down, is complex sugars into simple sugars like glucose. And so something, like if this was not a Diet Coke, I mean, it would be, you know, with regular Coke, it would be full of simple sugars. Either, probably sucrose or something like that. Now, there are also, of course, complex carbohydrates. If you're worried about your weight, you probably want to cut down on these. They also tend to make your blood sugars shoot up in terms of glucose metabolism. So, of course, you know, like bread's pretty good, pasta's pretty good, right? So if you're eating that all the time, a lot of that gets turned into, eventually into fat. Now, so a potato is a complex carbohydrate. Brussels sprouts, or if you look at a plant, a lot of the material that holds the plant up is called cellulose. And cellulose is, we really can't digest it. Cows can, but they actually can only digest it because they've got bacteria in their gut that do the digestion or the breakdown of cellulose. But cellulose is fiber. And so foods with fiber are generally good, especially since they slow the absorption of simple sugars. So a lot of people, obviously, they like fruits that are sweet. And you might say, well, you might want to cut back on your, you know, on your simple sugars that are found in fruits. But it actually turns out if you eat the fruits, there's a lot of fiber in there, and that slows the absorption of the sugars. Whereas if you take a fruit juice, that's not the case, and it goes straight into your system as glucose and is liable to spike your blood sugar level, which is one of the hallmarks of being diabetic. So carbohydrates, there's a carbon and a hydrate. And the basic formula for a carbon is CX. That means X is a variable. 2 hydrogens, and then Y is a variable for oxygen. So it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? Usually the water is in the form of an ion, a negative ion, and so it's actually a hydroxyl group. Okay. Our body can only use monosaccharides. So if we have disaccharides like sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, that has to be broken down into a monomer, so like a glucose monomer. Okay, and glucose is basically the energy that a cell needs to do all its metabolic work. And then a polysaccharide, again, we have these long chains. These are polymers. And they're all they're single monomers all strung together with water. Except that the water in this case is split up into, there's a hydroxyl group, I think right here. Okay, so starch and cellulose are polysaccharides. Things like potatoes, corn, wheat, a bunch of different things are complex carbohydrates. And, oh, also, there's another thing. Sugars or carbohydrates is actually part of DNA. So when we get to DNA, you'll see that the backbone, where all the nitrogen bases are strung off of, is made up of phosphorus and these sugar bases. Okay. So potatoes are obviously digestible fairly easily. Cellulose, no. Let's see. Termites are able to digest cellulose because they have these commensal or these bacteria that mutualistic that help them break that down. Okay. Now, plants a lot of times store their energy in starches. So down here, looks like potatoes. And all the starches are basically stored there. So all these complex carbohydrates. Now, the cellulose, on the other hand, is often stored up in the stems and leaves. And our body is not very good at breaking that stuff down in terms of for food. Okay. So cellulose is the source of what's called dietary fiber. You've probably heard about dietary fiber because it keeps you regular. It doesn't add any calories to what you're eating that you can actually break down into useful calories. But in general, a lot of animals can use it because they have these symbiotic bacteria in their guts that help them. Now, we don't have that. We don't have those kind of bacteria, but cows do, a lot of ruminants, a lot of insects do as well. Okay. So glucose metabolism is the basis for energy that a cell can use. And therefore, all cells actually need glucose. Okay? Every single one of them. Just for carrying out regular, simple metabolic functions. Now, complex carbohydrates are digested. They're slowly broken down. And that would seem to be a good thing, but if you actually eat complex carbohydrates, they tend to spike your blood sugars. Simple sugars enter our system quickly, though fiber, as I mentioned, can slow that down. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. Oh, Christ. Hold on a second. And then the one that most of us are aware of is type 2 diabetes, and it's actually a metabolic disorder, and it's associated with not necessarily making not enough insulin, but our cells become resistant to it. So you have insulin resistance. Now, there's another video that you should watch on why we actually have type 2 diabetes so common in our environment right now. And that is, in our past, we didn't live in a food secure environment. When our ancestors were hunter-gatherers or simple farmers. So hunter-gatherers are always out hunting and gathering. They store some food, but there are going to be times of food shortages, like famines, right? The same thing goes for crops and crop failures. So people who tend to get obese in our environment, which is a food-rich environment, back then they would survive famines, whereas skinny folks wouldn't. Okay? So nowadays, if you have someone who's skinny, who can eat anything they want, and they never gain an ounce, if you put them back in an environment where there was a famine, they would die, but their brethren, who wouldn't be fat in that environment, but would have a slower metabolism, would manage to survive. So it's not actually a metabolic disorder per se, it's only a metabolic disorder in the specific environment. Okay. Now, insulin is a hormone, that means it's a protein. It's a small protein, and what it does is it triggers the cells to uptake glucose via what's called GLUT4. Okay, so here is here's an insulin receptor. Here's insulin. Insulin is when it's taken up by the hormone, then it allows glucose to actually enter the cell, and it goes through this process. It can either be turned into fatty acids, it can be turned into something called glycogen, which is a way for the body to take basically what are like carbohydrates and store them and use them quickly. Okay? Let's see. Oh, yeah. And then, of course, in the plasma membrane, there's an influx of glucose, glycogen synthesis, and then glycolysis, where they actually break down glucose and then turn it into what's called ATP. Okay. So animals store excess carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, which is basically glucose that's been changed a little bit. Your brain only can use glucose, okay? Period. Whereas there are other kinds of monosaccharides that other body cells can use. So when we exercise, usually the first things that we're breaking down, except for free glucose in the bloodstream, is glycogen in the muscles and in the liver. And that allows what's called cellular respiration, which is glucose metabolism. And glucose metabolism is the most efficient way to generate the energy currency that a cell actually uses, and that's called ATP. Okay. So metabolic rate. It's the rate at which the body actually uses energy. Metabolic rate is influenced by a lot of different things, including your body weight, activity level, genetic makeup, and then the kind of food environment that you're actually in. So in terms of food quality and food abundance. Now, in our past, we ate all these natural foods, right? We rarely encountered simple sugars in our environment, like honey or something like that. Usually, our carbs were in forms of complex carbohydrates, okay? And, of course, then, in terms of quality, also fats were the same sort of thing. In fact, a lot of wild animals like deer, if you've ever had deer, they're very lean meat. There's hardly any fat at all on deer, on venison. Well, in our environment now, when like we smell fats cooking, we immediately get aroused, okay? And it's simply because if in our past, if we had come across a great source of, let's say, fats, we would have gobbled it all down right away. The chances of us eating too much fat were pretty small. And the same with sugar. Whereas now we have both of those things in huge quantities. So there's tremendous food abundance. And also in our past, there were times of plenty, of course, but there were also times of seasonal famines and then long-term famines as well. So our modern food environment is lots of simple sugars. There's also fats. There's lots of things that are low in fiber. In our ancestral environment, as I mentioned, pretty much we were governed by food insecurity. Okay, so type 1 diabetes, as I mentioned, is an autoimmune disorder. Type 2 is a metabolic disorder, but it's only a disorder in a certain environment. So, in an environment where there's a food shortage and having type 2 metabolic disorder, type 2 diabetes, those individuals would actually have higher fitness in our ancestral environments when there was a food shortage. They would out-survive skinny people back then. Now, there's another thing. As people age, they usually gain weight because they can't get around as fast anymore. And so that's why most people who develop type 2 diabetes do so later in age. Okay. Let's see. So here's energy and how we actually generate energy. Our food energy starts with glucose. It has to be converted to what's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that's the universal currency that our cell actually uses, is this molecule called ATP. Now, we don't store ATP. It's for use, immediate use. So the only way to get it is to actually burn glycogen or glucose right on the spot. So all of our cells can convert glucose to ATP. So glucose plus oxygen what you do is you end up with CO2, which is carbon dioxide, water, and then between 36 or 38 ATP molecules. Okay? Now, it turns out there's other ways of generating ATP, but it's not nearly as efficient, and it's called anaerobic fermentation. And usually it only results in 2 ATPs. This is called glycolysis, where glucose is first broken down. If it's aerobic with oxygen, then it goes into another pathway called the Krebs cycle. You don't have to know that. So the first thing that happens when we break down glucose, we usually break down most of it from our glycogen stores, which can be converted directly into ATP. Then, after that is all used up, we start breaking down fatty acids. And then, not until you burn through all available fatty acids and glycoprotein will your body actually start using fermentation pathway. And in fact, anybody who's ever, let's say, run a long distance, you know, or even a short distance very fast, you know that your muscles start burning. Well, that's because of the fermentation pathway and the buildup of lactic acid in your muscles. In other words, you've pretty much run out of the thing that you can use to turn things quickly into ATP. So it's called, yeah.
So if someone's like starving, there's no food, they're basically kind of eating themselves, right?
They are, exactly, yeah. So once you basically burn through everything, then your body actually starts breaking down protein, and it can actually turn that in a very long sort of metabolic pathway into a food source. But it's obviously, it's bad. So people who are undergoing a famine, they've got no more fat on their body at all, and they're basically starting to digest themselves.
And is that like how, for example, hibernation or something?
Okay, so yeah, so hibernation, animals that hibernate, what they are able to do is they're not doing that. They're actually, most animals that hibernate have put on tons of fat. Then they lower their metabolic rate and their baseline temperature. And so, because their metabolic rate is so low, they can survive off of those food stores like fat for a long time. Okay? Bears actually don't do hibernation, more rodents, but they do something like it. Okay? There's also what's called short-term hibernation called torpor. Like hummingbirds do that during the nighttime because they have such high metabolic rates. Actually, you can get humans, by lowering the body temperature, to really lower the metabolic rate as well. But we obviously can't go into hibernation. Okay, so a calorie is a unit of energy. It's actually enough energy to raise a 1 cubic centimeter of water 1 degree in temperature. Okay. When we talk about calories in our diet, we usually talk about calories as capital C, which is actually 1,000 calories. Okay? In other words, a kilocalorie. So small c for physical chemistry, big C kilocalories, because that's how much energy we're actually taking in the form of glucose or fat. Now, it turns out, let's see, 3,500 calories is 1 pound of fat. There's something called the body mass index. Probably heard of it, BMI. It's kilograms per meter squared. So how tall you are, and then the weight divided by how tall you are. Okay? Now, the healthy range is usually 20 to 25, obesity above 30. Now, this is not the same as percent body fat, but it's correlated. Now, the thing is, it's not a great measure because muscle tissue weighs more than fat tissue does. If you have a ton of muscle tissue, in terms of kilograms of muscle over how tall you are, that'll give you a high BMI when in fact you're not. Actually, most of you is actually lean muscle tissue. So there's actually other ways of measuring percent body fat and BMI than just that rough estimate. Women tend to need more body fat to maintain health and fertility than men do. So women, you're on an estrous cycle monthly. You tend to need more fat intake and more body fat. And then when you're pregnant or lactating, then you need tremendous stores of body fat. So a lot of like women marathon athletes, a lot of them actually have a hard time getting pregnant. In fact, a lot of them stop having their period because they don't have enough body fat to support that sort of stuff. If they start eating again, then it's fine. So for women, healthy body fat ranges from 12 to 31%. For men, 5 to 25%. Just some ways of weighing it. Hydrostatic weighing, you put yourself in water. And you can conductance in terms of how an electrical current is passed through muscle tissue compared to fat. You can actually then get a better measure of BMI. Now, in terms of weight gain and loss, there's an energy balance model. Basically, energy in and energy out. So, in other words, that's the model that most diets are based on. In other words, is weight loss a matter of willpower? Now, this model, it turns out, is not an actual model of human metabology, metabolic energy generation. And I'll explain that in a while. So, as you can see from this model, you have energy in, and you have supposedly just the right number of calories coming in per day. And then you actually burn calories, about the same that you actually take in. Of course, if you overeat, then your body's going to convert that first into glycogen and then into fats. So here we are with our food environment again. During a famine, our body basically slows down its metabolic rate. And it slows down its metabolic rate significantly. This is called what's called the thrifty alleles hypothesis. In other words, it's a way to survive famines. Okay, now, has anybody in here has probably knows from undergoing a diet? Sometimes you can quickly lose weight, but to actually keep it off is very difficult. And the reason is that when you're lowering your energy intake in the form of food, what your body is actually doing is it's saying, oh, there must be a famine going on. So it immediately lowers your metabolic rate, so you're not burning as much energy, and to conserve as much energy as possible. So once you are off the diet, but you're still kind of limiting your intake, your body, unfortunately, it's not like your body, the metabolic rate actually goes back up. It actually stays lower. And so that's why a lot of people who try as they might, they end up gaining all the weight back. If you look at, anybody in here watch The Biggest Loser? Okay. Yeah. Okay, it turns out every one of those people, they all gained all the weight back, and in many cases they gained more than when they went in. Okay? I mean, they were losing hundreds of pounds, right? They went to what's called, a fat farm, whatever, where their intake was, they lost weight very quickly, but after that, their metabolic rate was so low that they really essentially, any food in excess of a very small amount was immediately turned into fat again. And the body looked at that fat store as important and held on to it at all costs. Because if you've undergone a famine, in an accessible food environment, what that's doing is telling your body, well, perhaps you might another one. Okay? So it puts your body into this kind of metabolic rate that conserves as much energy as possible. So the whole willpower thing was all based on this faulty model of food in, food out. Doesn't work that way. It actually works so that their body, when you go into a diet, it then remembers and it lowers your overall metabolic rate and keeps it low. Now, it turns out there are some people who go in for bariatric surgery, which has had better successes. And what it does is, in addition to lowering your food intake, it actually resets your metabolic rate as well. Okay? So, anytime someone says, well, you're trying to lose weight, oh, yeah, it's going to be almost impossible for actually you to keep that weight off. Okay. Now, metabolism, these are actually chemical reactions, right? They involve a lot of hormones, like insulin. And we have basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of metabolism we need for keeping cells healthy and active. Okay? It's called resting metabolic rate. Now, in metabolism, when our metabolism is actually doing things, it is either breaking down stuff that's catabolic, for example, glycogen and fat storage, or fat usage, or our muscles can actually be used for energy under certain circumstances that we mentioned before.
What do they, when someone says, oh, you have a fast metabolism or?
That means you have a very high metabolic rate and you're burning through calories very quickly. Okay, so someone who has a high metabolic rate, let's say someone in great shape, a great athlete, they're able to eat a lot of food. I've had friends who in the past used to work on logging crews, and I mean they would eat commonly 6,000 calories a day, and we did that. We tip over, okay? But they're skinny the whole time because the work is so energy intensive. Okay, now. Low metabolic rate, on the other hand, allows you to conserve energy. Now, anabolic is the building up, I didn't go there, it's the building up, actually, in terms of metabolism, of new tissue, like muscle tissue, or new cells, things like that. And then catabolic is breaking things down, metabolism. So building muscle, first of all, a lot of people will lift weights. They're actually breaking down their muscle tissue to a certain point. And then the body starts repairing that with amino acids to build up protein and energy that requires ATP. Now, it turns out that you cannot build muscle while at a calorie deficit. In other words, if you're trying to lose weight and build muscle at the same time, you really can't do that. You have to do one or the other. Okay, muscle mass. Muscle tone is actually the product of two things: how much muscle there is and how much fat is on top of it. So you can build muscle by burning calories and building up new tissue, or you can lose fat by taking in fewer calories than you expend. But you can't do both at the same time. Oh, good. Okay.